Alright, good morning everybody. What we're going to do is go over the Biomed section and the Law and Safety section for the 3 tests and do a little general review. Then I'll do a separate recording for herbs because one of the groups doesn't really need the herbs, so we'll do that separately. So let's get going. So Biomed, what valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle? So that is B, the tricuspid valve. And that is the kind of question that they'll ask. So you might get asked a question, what valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle? That would be C, the mitral valve, or D, the bicuspid valve, because remember, mitral and bicuspid are the same thing. And do remember that the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve could be called the AV valves in conjunction. They're both between the atrium and the ventricle, so you can call them the AV valves. And then the choice A there, the semilunar valves, remember those are the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So those separate the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries and the left ventricle and the aorta, respectively. Number 2, what makes the second heart sound? So remember that the sounds are always caused by the closing of the valves. It makes more of a sound when you close something than when you open. So the closing of the semilunar valves make the second heart sound. The closing of the AV valves make the first heart sound. And do remember that they could make the question, not hard, but slightly harder by, instead of saying semilunar valves, maybe say the closing of the aortic and pulmonary valves. So make sure you know what valves go with what group. Number 3, which of the following are secreted by B cells? So B cells, remember, are white blood cells, or a fancy word for that, leukocytes. And remember the generality about how B cells work. B cells, when they encounter a pathogen, they differentiate into a new type of cell called a plasma cell. And then that plasma cell secretes choice B, immunoglobulins, and another word for that is antibodies. And remember that immunoglobulins and antibodies are not living cells in and of themselves. They're proteins that are shaped in a certain way that they bind to specific microbial invaders. So immunoglobulins or antibodies are the good guys that our B cells, our body cells make. And then these float around in the body fluids, essentially binding to any foreign invaders that they've been designed to bind to, if those are present. And that is called humoral immunity. Humoral immunity. The other choices here, choice A, antigens. Remember, antigens are the bad guy. In terms of when you're talking about this, every cell has antigens. They're basically protein markers that identify the cell. So, even our own cells have antigens on them. They have antigenic markers. But here, when we're talking about our immune system attacking a foreign invader, generally the antigen is the bad guy, and we make antibodies against the antigen. T cells, choice C, remember that T cells are divided into 2 types. The T helper cells, which are kind of like the triage nurse, where the T helper cells see what foreign invader is present, secrete chemicals that tell the rest of the immune system what to do. So it's kind of, some people refer to it as the master switch of the immune system. And then T killer cells. T killer cells are cells that are T cells, but they're cells that are designed to destroy body cells that are infected with some type of virus usually, or body cells that are becoming cancerous, becoming a tumor. So you're essentially making cells that directly attack and kill other infected or damaged cells. That's referred to as cell-mediated immunity. Now, also remember about B cells. B cells and T cells are both considered to be a subgroup of white blood cells called lymphocytes. And they do get that name because they are mostly found in the lymph vessels. And then the last cell there, D, natural killer cells. They're similar to T killer cells. They also kill infected or damaged cells. The difference, though, is natural killer cells are part of your innate immunity. They work very similarly from the moment you're born to the moment you die. You don't make new strains of T killer cells to deal with specific microbial invaders, whereas the T killer cells, you do make specific strains of T killer cells for every specific virus or microbial invader that your body is attacking. Okay, number 4, how many lobes does the left lung have? This is just a straightforward one. So the left lung has 2, the right lung has 3. That's it. Nothing else to really say there. Number 5, the blanks secrete intrinsic factor which helps a person to absorb blanks. So that's the parietal cells of the stomach, and that helps you to absorb vitamin B12. Remember, vitamin B12 is kind of a wimpy vitamin. It would be destroyed by all the enzymes in your GI tract if it didn't have this special protein called intrinsic factor to protect it. So intrinsic factor sort of protects the B12, and then you're able to absorb it later in the ileum of the small intestine. As far as the other choices, the chief cells are a real cell. Those are also cells in the stomach, and remember, they secrete pepsin, which helps your body to digest protein. Number 6, which of the following requires ATP? So this is coming from the biology biochem handout that I gave you guys. We didn't spend too much time going over that because remember, biology biochem, there's 5 questions each. And obviously each of those classes were huge classes. So to go over the amount of material we'd have to go over to get everything that could possibly be asked, it would be a ton of time that we would have to devote to it, and you wouldn't get very much bang for your buck. So for that material, remember, look at the study guide I gave you. Focus on knowing some of those really core topics as best as possible, some of those key bullet points. And then out of the 5 questions each, maybe you'll get, maybe you'll get all of them. But expect that there'll be a few questions. It's always the last 10 that these questions come from. Expect that there'll be a few questions that you're just, wow, we didn't go over this. Expect that. It's okay. You could miss all of them and still pass. Know the anatomy, physiology really well. Look at the biochem, biology, enough to recognize some core bullet points. So that being said, number 6. Which of the following requires ATP? So remember, you need ATP when you talk about moving a substance from low concentration to high concentration against the natural gradient that it wants to go. Remember, you do not need ATP when something is going from high to low, because that's just the general direction that things naturally spread in. So simple diffusion, which is usually a fat-soluble substance moving from high to low concentration right through the fat-soluble cell membrane, that certainly does not require any ATP, no energy to force that to happen. Facilitated diffusion, this is the one that people often make the mistake on. This is where something like sodium, for example, requires a channel. Sodium is a water-soluble molecule, or ion, really. It can't pass directly through a fat-soluble cell membrane. It needs a special channel. That's the facilitated part. But it's still moving from high to low, so there is no ATP involved. Active transport, that would be, the main example of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump. And remember, the sodium-potassium pump is pumping sodium out of a cell and pumping potassium in the cell. Now remember, there's lots of sodium out of the cell, lots of potassium in the cell, and this pump is always pumping more of it in those directions. So you're forcing sodium to go from low to high. You're forcing potassium to go from low to high. That is exactly what requires ATP. And choice D, moving particles from high to low, again, no, that's exactly what does not require ATP. And remember that the sodium-potassium pump is really, really important, because if it weren't for that pump, sodium would accumulate in the cell. Every time, particularly use this pump a lot when you're talking about cells that engage in action potentials and stuff. And even if you don't remember every detail of those, you do remember that sodium rushing into the cell has something to do with an action potential. If you didn't have this pump to pump it out, sodium would accumulate in the cell. That would draw water in, because we know that water likes to follow sodium. That would draw water into the cell, and the cell would burst. So you need this pump in order to kind of prevent that from happening. Okay, so number 7, what organelle is responsible for making proteins? So that would be the ribosomes. The ribosomes are the cells that are the organelles in a cell that make proteins. And remember, they're located on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're also free in the cytoplasm, but they are also found on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So it's not wrong to say that the rough endoplasmic reticulum makes proteins. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the portion of the endoplasmic reticulum without ribosomes, is usually known more for making fat-soluble molecules. Then the Golgi complex, remember, is the thing that comes up a lot for packaging. A lot of times they call it the UPS center of a cell, and it basically packages, if the cell makes some kind of some type of molecule that needs to travel through the blood, it packages it in special vesicles. Okay. And then the mitochondria is, of course, responsible for making ATP, making energy in the cell. And then number 8, which of the following is a disaccharide? So that's B. Sucrose, remember, is made of 1 glucose and 1 fructose. Choice A, glucose, is a monosaccharide. That's the simplest sugar you can get. C, fructose, is also a monosaccharide. And remember, those two, it's the exact same ingredients for both. They're both C6H12O6, glucose and fructose. So, but they're different shapes. You know, everything's arranged a little differently, so they're different shapes. So they're said to be isomers of each other, glucose and fructose. The other monosaccharide is galactose, but it's not listed here. And starch is, of course, a polysaccharide. Starch is a polysaccharide. So starch has is basically many glucose molecules linked together. And the other disaccharides that aren't listed here are lactose, which is a galactose and glucose, and maltose, which is 2 glucose molecules. Okay, so going to test 2. Okay, number 1, what muscle has the function of retracting the scapula? So out of these choices, that would be the rhomboids. Remember, the middle trapezius also helps with that motion. The rhomboids are just deep or underneath the middle trapezius. As far as some of the other choices, the upper traps are responsible for holding the neck up, and they're responsible for elevating the scapula. Pec minor, that's responsible for protracting the scapula because it goes from your ribs to your coracoid process, and so therefore it protracts the scapula. And the teres minor, one of your rotator cuff muscles, that's back here. It's responsible for laterally rotating your humerus, so like this type of action, helping it rotate laterally. Okay. Number 2, which of the following is not a landmark on the scapula? And A, B, and C all are. Choice D, the greater tubercle, that's a landmark on the lateral edge of the upper humerus here, not on the scapula. Scapula, remember, has a lot of landmarks. Acromion, coracoid, those are definitely 2 major landmarks. It also has the glenoid fossa, which is the little depression that the humeral head fits into to form the shoulder joint. I would say if you get any question about a landmark and you know it's in this general area, and they ask what bone is that landmark on, scapula is your best guess, unless you know for a fact that, oh no, this particular landmark is located on the cervical spine or whatever. Unless you know for a fact, scapula is your best guess. Number 3, if someone has not eaten in several days, which hormone would you expect to see high levels of? So in other words, they're starving. Their blood sugar, amongst other things, but their blood sugar is going to be low. So, answer. Hi, Butters. So their blood sugar is going to be low, so you need to raise their blood sugar. That would be glucagon. Glucagon is secreted by the pancreas in a low blood sugar situation, and it functions to break down stored material like glycogen, fat, muscles, to help bring up or raise your blood sugar, so therefore to keep you going. Choice A, insulin, does the opposite. Insulin is made by the islet cells of the pancreas, and that does the opposite. If you just had a big meal and a lot of blood sugar came into your bloodstream, or a lot of sugar came into your bloodstream, it would wind up stimulating the uptake of that glucose into your body cells for storage and use. So remember, in terms of some fancy words that you might see come up, insulin promotes the storage of glucose, since you have a lot of it. So insulin promotes things like glycogenesis, lipogenesis, where glucagon promotes the breaking down of fat and glycogen. So glycogenolysis, lipolysis. In terms of places where we store glucose, remember the two places this comes up a lot. We store glucose as glycogen in skeletal muscle and in the liver. And then in terms of the other choices here, choice B, calcitonin, remember the thyroid gland secretes that, and calcitonin is responsible for inhibiting the osteoclast. And by inhibiting osteoclast, it essentially raises, it causes more calcium to go into the bone and therefore builds the bone. A lot of times we'll remember calcitonin tones the bones. Choice D, melatonin, remember, is secreted by the pineal gland, which is located in the brain, and this regulates sleep-wake cycles. We're all pretty familiar with melatonin, I think. Number 4, another hormone question. What is the function of antidiuretic hormone? That is choice B. It increases reabsorption of water by the collecting duct of the kidneys. As far as, and that basically will make you urinate less, cause you to hold on to more fluid in the blood. So it increases your blood volume and therefore increases blood pressure. So you'll generally make ADH when you have a low blood volume or dehydration or low blood pressure type of situation. Remember that this is one of those hormones that is made by the hypothalamus but stored and secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin is the other one that fits that bill. As far as the other choices go, choice A, kidneys, cause the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. That's aldosterone, which is secreted by the adrenal glands. Choice C, cause increased urination. Actually, there's no one specific hormone that we need to worry about for year ends that does that. And choice D, lowers blood pressure. There is a hormone, and that's the one ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, but that's something that not one of the main endocrine hormones. Remember, it's secreted by the atria of the heart, so it's not likely to make it as an endocrine question on the year ends. Number 5, what is the location of the uterus? And this is just a good example of a type of location question they like to ask. They love to ask particularly about the sort of somewhat obscure organs that not everybody knows where exactly they're located. Like if they said where's the heart located, we all know it's about right here. But the uterus, people have a vague idea that it's kind of down there somewhere, but as far as exactly where it's located, not a lot of average people necessarily know that. So what is the location of the uterus? It is A, superior and posterior to the bladder. It's basically found between the bladder and the rectum. And as far as other choices here, they're just wrong choices. There's really nothing posterior to the rectum. There's really nothing specific in between the kidneys other than the spine. And as far as inferior to the urinary bladder goes, the only thing that would really answer that is if they're asking about the male reproductive system, the prostate would be inferior to the urinary bladder. Number 6, surfactant does which of the following? And there's a couple ways you can phrase this. Remember that the alveoli of the lungs have this natural tendency to want to collapse and not easy to get them to open up, at least the way they would work without surfactant. Surfactant, though, decreases what they call that surface tension. There's this surface tension that causes the alveoli to want to collapse, want to shut. Surfactant decreases that surface tension, so it makes the alveoli more easily expandable. Another way to say that is it increases lung compliance. So that is choice B. Everything else here is just a wrong choice. there's nothing that decreases lung compliance other than not having surfactant. We already talked choice C, that's intrinsic factor, that would do that. And choice D causes ovulation, that's luteinizing hormone that surges and triggers ovulation. Okay, number 7, what represents the order of the sections of the small intestine from stomach to cecum? So that is choice C, D, J, I, duodenum, jejunum, ileum. All the other choices are just wrong orders, so that's straightforward. Number 8, what cranial nerve is responsible for moving the eyeball straight downward? So that is B, cranial nerve 3. Because remember, all those choices here have to do with the eye, but cranial nerve 2 is vision only, so it's only the sense of vision. Basically light hits the back of the eyeball, hits the retina, that triggers an action potential down the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, to the back of the brain where you then process it. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, that only moves the eyeball in one direction, down and in towards the tip of the nose, so like cross-eyed. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, only moves the eyeball laterally, out to the side. Cranial nerve 3 moves it in every other direction. So here I just said straight downward. It's not what 4 and 6 do, so it's cranial nerve 3. And remember, 3 also moves the eyeball and does a couple other things. It constricts the pupil and it raises the eyelid. So cranial nerve 3 has 3 major functions that it does. Number 9, which of the following represents the sections of the brainstem in order from superior to inferior? And that is B, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Everything else just represents a wrong order or things that don't apply. So I guess I will quickly mention the things that don't apply in case they don't come up in other questions. So in choice A, cerebellum, remember the cerebellum is its own section of the brain. It's a little area underneath and behind the occipital lobe here. And remember that its responsibility is mostly coordination, proprioception, equilibrium, coordination of skilled movements. So this is what you call your muscle memory. When you first learn a skilled movement, you have to work really hard. Think about something like handwriting, how long it takes to really get that down. When you first learn to write your name, the letters are all over the place, and they're huge, and they're sideways. But eventually you get to the point where you can just zoop and write it. So that's because the cerebellum is behind the scenes coordinating exactly how your cerebral cortex orders its commands to the muscles. So it's kind of behind the scenes regulating that. And that's why over time you just know in your cerebral cortex, I want to write this word. And without even really thinking about it, without putting much effort, you can just sort of automatically do it. And that's because the cerebellum has sort of learned how to coordinate that firing of those action potentials in such a way that it sort of automatically happens. Then choice C includes the diencephalon, and remember the diencephalon is a part of the brain. It's the core part of the brain. So you have the cerebral hemispheres out here, and up in there is the diencephalon. And the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the pituitary are all located in the diencephalon. And choice D, it mentions the thalamus, which remember that is the relay station. A lot of times that's what it'll be referred to as, that all sensory input from everywhere in the body goes through the thalamus, and then from the thalamus you send a branch to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex so you can integrate it. So you become aware that my baby toe hurts, I hit my knee, my right hand is hot, whatever it might be. And then hypothalamus, remember that's part nervous tissue, but it's also part endocrine. Remember, it's the master gland of the endocrine system. Then number 10, which of the following represents a cluster of rod-shaped bacteria? So remember, staphylo means cluster, bacilli means rod. The other choices, so that's choice C. The other choices, choice A, strepto means chain, cocci means circular, so streptococci. a chain of circles. Staphylococi, a cluster of circles. Choice D, diplobacilli. Diplo means paired, so it'd be a pair of rods. Okay, so that's number last one there. So now going to the third test. Number 1, which vertebra does not have a body or a spinous process? So remember, that's C1, the atlas. That's known, it's just basically a circular vertebra. It's literally just kind of a circle with a big hollow area in the middle. Couple transverse processes sticking out, because remember the vertebral arteries have to go through spinous process. I'm sorry, did I say spinous? Let me start over. Which vertebra does not have a body or a spinous process? C1, the atlas. And C1 is basically just a circular vertebra, big opening in the middle, couple transverse processes sticking out. And remember, all the cervical vertebrae have transverse processes, because the vertebral arteries have to go through little openings in those processes. So C1 is known for the fact that there's no body, there's no spinous process. C2, that's the axis. It does have a body, but it's shaped a little differently than a normal vertebra. It does have a body. It does have a little bit of a spinous process. But remember that the shape is a little different. But what it's really most known for is it has this little extra appendage called a dens or an odontoid process that sticks up, fits into C1. So you have that C1 little circle. Dens kind of fits into it, creates a little pivot joint for rotation of the neck. So that's C1 and C2. Everything else has bodies and spinous processes. So as far as choices here, C3, L5, I mean, those are just, they do have those things. They have everything. There's nothing unique about them. They just have all the parts that a vertebra has. Remember, the body is the most anterior section, spinous process most posterior. Remember, vertebrae get bigger as they go down. So L5 is the largest of your vertebrae. Number 2, which of the following is made in the hypothalamus? Well, I already mentioned this. Remember that there are 2 hormones that are made in the hypothalamus but stored and secreted by the posterior pituitary. And that's oxytocin, which is the correct answer here, choice A, and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin, remember its function is to promote milk ejection for lactation and to cause the uterus to contract during childbirth. Then B, renin, that's made by the kidneys, and remember that's what starts that whole renin, angiotensin, aldosterone cycle, and ultimately that whole cycle raises blood pressure, but renin's made by the kidneys. Cortisol is made by the adrenal cortex, and it functions to raise glucose levels in the blood during a fight or flight situation, so you have energy to be able to run away. And choice D, ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, comes from the anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates the adrenals to release cortisol. Number 3, what is a function of the cerebellum? Well, I already kind of elaborated on this on the last test. So it's B, coordinating voluntary movements. In terms of some of the other choices here, A, judgment. Judgment is more like critical thinking and conscious awareness. You need all that for judgment. So that's more cerebrum, cerebral cortex, specifically more frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. C, regulating breathing, that's organ activity. So regulating breathing, that would be the brainstem. Remember that the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, has areas on it that regulate organ activity. Respiratory center, and then cardiac center, vasomotor center. So that's more brainstem. And then D, initiating muscle contractions. In other words, like conscious decision to initiate a muscle contraction. I guess I should specify here if we're talking about skeletal muscle. That would be primary motor cortex, which is part of, again, the cerebral cortex. That's where you consciously think, I want to move this muscle. Number 4, which cranial nerve controls the muscles of mastication? In other words, chewing, the bitum muscles, the masseter, the temporalis, the buccinator. That would be choice A, cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. Remember, the trigeminal nerve is sensory for the face. Sometimes we remember 5 fingers, slap to the face, sensory to the face, and it controls the motor movement of the muscles of chewing. B, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, that's motor to the face overall, so smiling, frowning, wrinkling the forehead, furrowing the brow, all that stuff, does have a little bit of sensation, and that's the anterior 2/3 of the tongue for taste. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens, we already talked about, lateral movement of the eyeball, and cranial nerve 3, we already talked about all those functions that it does. Number 5, what cranial nerve causes wrinkling of the forehead? So we just mentioned that. That's choice A, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. B, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. Remember, that's the longest cranial nerve in the body, and it goes into the body core, and it regulates organ activity. So cranial nerve 10 regulates the heart rhythm, it regulates digestion, it regulates bladder. Basically everything goes all the way down to the pelvic cavity, and it carries parasympathetic axons, so it slows the heart rate down, opens the bronchi, promotes peristalsis, that kind of thing. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal, we already talked about, and cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal, remember, is purely responsible for movement of the tongue. Number 6, where do all muscles that flex the wrist and fingers originate? So remember, all the flexor muscles of the arm originate at the medial epicondyle. So everything with the word flexor in the name, pretty much. I mean, there are some smaller flexor muscles that don't go all the way here, but all the ones that say flexor carpi, whether it's, say, ulnaris or radialis, doesn't matter, or flexor digitorum, and also the pronator teres goes from here to the radius, so it kind of pulls it in a pronation motion. And then there is one called the palmaris longus that just runs straight to the palm, and again helps flex the wrist. They all originate on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Conversely here, if I said all the muscles that extend the wrist and fingers, extensor carpi radialis, extensor digitorum, the answer would be lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The other choice is just, there's not really anything to say that would apply to this question. Number 7, which blood vessels carry oxygen from the digestive organs to the liver? That would be C, the hepatic portal vein. Remember, it carries all blood away from the GI to the liver. That way the liver can take glucose from it, so it can store it as glycogen. It could take amino acids, so it can make proteins for the body. And the liver gets basically first dibs on newly absorbed nutrients from the GI. Don't confuse that with just the plain hepatic vein. That's just a vein that's going to take blood from the liver back to the heart. Technically, it goes to the inferior vena cava, which then goes to the heart. And hepatic artery is going to go from the aorta to the liver. And then choice D, mesenteric artery, that's a branch from the aorta to the GI organs. Mesenteric, remember, entero means intestine. So that is an artery, brings blood from the aorta to the intestines. Okay, number 8, what meningeal layer comes into direct contact with the brain and the spinal cord? So remember, the meninges are a padding of connective tissue that basically surrounds the brain and the spinal cord and provides cushioning so you don't get brain banging into skull every time you move. So the meninges are made up of 3 layers: the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, the dura mater. The pia, remembers, the deepest, so that comes into direct contact with the brain and the spinal cord, arachnoid in the middle, and dura is the most superficial. Dura is by far the thickest and strongest, hence the name dura, meaning durable. And remember that the cerebrospinal fluid circulates between the pia and the arachnoid. It's called the subarachnoid space, and that further provides cushioning and whatnot for the brain. Choice D is just made up, so don't worry about that. Question 9, in a DNA molecule, which base pairs with adenine? So remember, you've got the 4 base pairs. Adenine, actually they're mostly listed here, so choice A, cytosine, thymine, and guanine plus the adenine. The methine is just kind of made up as it's not one of the base pairs. So a simple thing is just remember that A pairs with T, so adenine pairs with thymine, and C pairs with G. Cytosine pairs with guanine. If you just remember kind of A, T go together, C, G go together, you'll do fine as far as questions like this go. And then lastly, which of the following is true of isotopes? Choice A, they have the same, choice B, they have the same atomic number. So first, let's just define what an isotope is in case anybody forgets what it is. An isotope is basically the same element. So for example, if I have 2 atoms of carbon, they're both carbon. So they both have the same number of protons, and that's what the atomic number is. Atomic number is the number of protons. So if they're 2 atoms of carbon, they are both going to be have the same number of protons because they are the same element. But they might have different numbers of neutrons, because remember that neutrons, they add weight to the element, to the atom, but they don't really change what the atom is. So something could be, you can have 2 atoms of carbon, they both have, I want to say 6 protons, but they, one of them might have 6 neutrons, another might have 7 neutrons. And that's when you hear about like carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14. The one with 6 neutrons, you basically add the 6 neutrons, 6 protons, you get carbon 12. If it has 7 neutrons, you add the 7 neutrons, 6 protons, you get carbon 13. Those are examples of isotopes. They have the same atomic number, but different number of neutrons, and therefore they have a different weight. As far as some of the other choices go, choice A, they have the same number of neutrons but different number of protons. That doesn't really apply. There's no term for that. Choice C, they have a different number of protons and electrons. Now remember, normally an atom will have an equal number of protons and electrons, and that makes it a neutral entity. It's neutrally charged. When you lose or gain electrons and have a different number of protons and electrons, that's when you call it an ion. It becomes a charged particle. So when hydrogen, for example, loses its electron, it becomes H+. That's a hydrogen ion. And then D, they are molecules with the same atoms but arranged in different shapes. That we talked about already. That's an isomer. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll just do the couple of law and safety questions on each test, and then I'll make a separate video for herbs that one of the groups would benefit from, the other one doesn't need as much for now. Okay, so going to test 1, question 1 on law and safety. If a person comes to you and explains that they have pills at home and plan on taking the bottle tonight to end their life, you should do which of the following? And the answer is D, call 911. Remember the rule with that is, sometimes this is hard for people to grasp, the idea that you would call 911 because of something that somebody says they might do to themselves. But the general rule of it in terms of our liability, responsibility, is it's one thing if somebody just sort of generally says, and one day I'm just going to kill myself. That you might mention choice A or B or C. But if they specifically say, they give you a time frame and they have a specific plan, like in this case, I have pills at home and I'm going to take them tonight, that's the line where you have to actually call emergency services for that. Number 2, the attendance requirement for all PCOM shifts is B 100%. And just the idea there is that, sometimes you might be like, what do you mean? Like, I've missed shifts before, but you have to make them up. There's really no excuse that would get you out of making them up. You have to do every hour of clinic in order to graduate, in order to get licensed, all of that stuff. So it is 100%. You ultimately have to make it up, even if it is the world's most exceptional emergency. Going to test 2, law and safety. If a student gets approval from the supervisor to needle a certain set of points, but as he's needling he feels a tight muscle band in the patient's shoulder and would like to add a point, which of the following is allowed? And the answer here is C. The student must receive supervisor approval before needling that point. And the reason, like, again, they have some questions like this is, sure, in real life, you might have a supervisor that's very laid back and just like, yeah, that's fine, whatever. Okay, cool, yeah, great, glad you did that, perfect, and that's fine, if the individual supervisor kind of gives you carte blanche. But as far as the rules go, the supervisor technically has to sign off and authorize everything you do to a patient, because you're not a licensed practitioner. So in theory, everything you do, they have to sign off on. Now, if they sort of give you advance permission to just do whatever, then that's fine. That's between you and the supervisor. But the rule is you need to get permission before you do anything. Number 2, which of the following describes the spreading of athlete's foot to the patient's upper body from reusing a needle? So this is what you call an autogenous infection, because you're taking something that the patient is already carrying and you're spreading it to a different area of their body. Right now, athlete's foot's a fungal infection, and it's located on the foot, and it's basically stuck there on the foot. But you touched the foot, massaged it, needled it, whatever, and then you took that same needle, those same hands, didn't wash your hands, and you touched their face or something. You're spreading it from one area of the body to another, something that they already had. That's an autogenous infection. Choice A, a cross infection, that's where you have something perhaps, and you transfer it to the patient, or you transfer something from patient A to patient B. And this is one of the reasons that we're supposed to wash our hands, glove up if we have something that might potentially be contagious, because you don't want to cross-infect somebody. So if you had a patient that came into your office with athlete's foot, let's say, and you massaged his feet, and then didn't wash your hands and went and worked on another patient and gave him a full body massage or something, and then you gave him a fungal infection over the rest of his body, that would be an example of a cross-infection. Then choice B, biohazardous infection. There really is nothing called a biohazardous infection. Biohazardous waste is a solid or liquid that may present threat of infections to humans. So biohazardous waste would be something like a blood spill, let's say, that you certainly need to clean up, that you don't want people to be exposed to. And choice D, incubationary infection. Again, kind of a made-up one. There's really nothing called an incubationary infection, but the incubation period of the disease, remember, is where somebody might have an infection, but they're not yet showing symptoms. In other words, it's in there, it's incubating. They might have an infection, but they're not necessarily showing symptoms of having it. So that's an incubation period. And lots of diseases can have fairly long incubation periods. Hepatitis, HIV, they notoriously have very long ones. Somebody could have HIV for years and no particular symptoms of it. And then number 3, which of the following vaccines does the CDC recommend healthcare workers receive? And that's C, hepatitis B. So as far as the hepatitises go, just to make a couple mentions, because they do ask some questions regarding these. Hepatitis A is oral. It's caught oral fecal route. So you usually catch it from somebody not washing their hands properly and then making a sandwich for you or something. And it's often acute onset of a lot of flu-like symptoms, and particularly what you call a stomach flu, a lot of nausea, vomiting, and the person may get jaundice. It's very acute, abrupt, but it runs its course. It generally doesn't last. It doesn't cause permanent damage. There is a vaccine available, but because it's not, because it doesn't tend to cause permanent damage or anything, it tends to run its course. It's not one of the ones that the CDC, pushes healthcare workers to get. And because it's more oral fecal, and you get it from people preparing your food generally, it's not a bloodborne one that we worry as much about catching in a hospital setting. Then HIV, of course, they would recommend it if there were a vaccine, but of course there is no vaccine for HIV. But just as a quick reminder of what it is remember that HIV targets your CD4 lymphocytes, or your T helper cells, which play a major role in stimulating the immune response. So once those cells are destroyed, it's devastating. And remember, HIV often does not present with any symptoms until very, very late on when the person has AIDS. And AIDS is where their T helper cell levels have gotten so low that now they get opportunistic infections, where they catch all sorts of infections that they wouldn't normally get. So it's a very late AIDS, it's a very late stage HIV. And then hepatitis B, this is a blood-borne pathogen, just like HIV. You catch it from blood-to-blood contact. There is a vaccine, and it's a very contagious virus, so it is recommended that healthcare workers be vaccinated against Hep B. And then Hep C, again, this is also blood-borne. It would be recommended that you get a vaccination for it, but there is one in development. There is one that's kind of recently come out, but it's the test bank's not really updated for that yet. So for our purposes, there's not really a vaccine available for hepatitis C. And hepatitis C generally leads to a very low-grade, insidious, chronic infection of the liver that progresses little by little, low-grade over time, and little by little destroys the liver. So hepatitis C, almost 85% of the time, goes chronic. In fact, it's one of the most common chronic blood-borne viral infections in the U.S., and it often can lead to cirrhosis. And then E, both B and C, obviously. If you don't have one for C, then that doesn't work. And then test 3, number 1, what cell does the HIV virus attack? We already said it's B, the T helper cells, or the CD4 lymphocytes. And then number 2, which set of laws and regulations governs safety in the workplace for employees? That's OSHA. So they do ask some of these things. So HIPAA, remember, that more has to do with protecting patients' privacy. So the HIPAA laws have more to do with where you store files, who you're allowed to communicate with regarding a patient's health, rules regarding security of their information. OSHA is about safety of employees. CDC is the Center for Disease Control, so that kind of puts out a lot of recommendations that affect the healthcare industry. And the SEC, that's the Securities and Exchange Commission, so that doesn't really have anything to do with this. That's just a wrong answer that I had to come up with. Okay, so overall, I did give you a little bit of a study guide for the law and safety section. That's where you'll get a lot of these answers from, and if you go through that, you should do fine. Most of the law and safety stuff is straightforward. Most of it is somewhat intuitive. If you just go with what seems to be the most obvious answer, you'll get the law and safety questions right. But there are certainly things about like hepatitis and HIV that you have to know. It's not really intuitive. So if you go through, if you listen to what we talked about here and you go through the study guide that I gave you on the first day of class, you'll do fine. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention that I know can come up is in terms of preventing the diseases we just talked about, hepatitis and HIV. Remember universal precautions. And that's where you treat every patient essentially as though they might have everything. Treat every patient as though they have everything. That's universal precautions. That's the washing your hands, clean needle technique, don't touch the shaft of the needle, be very careful when it comes to drops of blood, all of that stuff. You treat every patient as though they could have everything. Universal precautions, and that's what protects us from hopefully getting infected with some of these things. Alright, so that's that. Only thing we have left now is I'll do a separate video for the herbs, and then that will be that, y'all.